Hello, I'm Vanessa de Oliveira Andreotti. I'm speaking to you from the unceded ancestral lands of the Stolo indigenous peoples. And as we offer a land acknowledgement, it's very important to recognize our responsibility to support indigenous efforts to have stolen lands back and to have their livelihoods restored. I'm also a person of mixed heritage, with my mom coming from a Guarani ancestry, my dad from German ancestry. I was born and raised in Brazil, and I came to Canada, this place we call Canada, through a marriage with a family that is both Cree and Blackfoot. And I choose to identify as a racialized settler in this place we call Canada in order to respect the struggles and the place of enunciation of Indigenous peoples from here. And today I am going to be talking about deaf education origins in an overview. But I have to say that I have a cold, so that's why I can't go out. And also that this affects the way that I'm speaking today. So, the origins of depth education. Um, so in 2015, we started a very strong collaboration that was actually happening also before that in relationship to something else, but it is a collaboration with indigenous communities in Brazil in a network that is called Teia das Cinco Curas. And in 2015, our research team was just kind of supporting them to do whatever they wanted and figuring out a way of creating a research project around that could give them the resources to do what they really wanted to do. And what they wanted to do was to create an educational framework based on the Cinco Curas, which loosely translates as five healing modes. And these five healing modes are the ways that we heal our thinking, the ways we heal our sensations, our feelings, the ways we heal our relationships, our exchanges, and our connection with the cycles of life and death of the metabolism of the planet, or Mother Earth. So we started with that, with this framework, and at one point, the people in the research team who were also instructors at UBC asked the communities what we could do in the global north with people here to be able to translate some of the insights of this framework, which was created for indigenous communities, into Western education. And we had long conversations about that, and they're continuing. And the request of the communities was for an education that could help people in the global north, especially settlers, both racialized and non-racialized settlers, to sit with their complicity in harm in a way that was not shameful or guilt tripping, in a way that could activate a form of responsibility and humility and compassion to work together and to show up differently. And part of the conversation was that the kind of activists that were arriving in the community were arriving from with a very idealized projection of both the communities and of themselves. And these collaborations were generally short-lived, because when you idealize something, either about yourself or about the community you're working with, at any time that you see the complexities of things, that your motivation go away. So they wanted long-term collaborations with people who could stay for the long haul and the difficulties and the complexities and the paradoxes and contradictions of the process. And they said that we could not do that only cognitively. So in about 2017, we started looking at this more seriously. I had been doing work a lot in my own research as a Canada Research Chair, and now David Lam Chair in Multiculturalism, on the North and South relations and questions of education. So we started thinking about how to think about an education that could crack Western education and help open up possibilities for this visceral responsibility to come through. So visceral responsibility is not about an intellectual choice or a matter of convenience or a calculation of benefit that you have. It's that sense that you know what the most responsible thing to do is, but you know it also goes against your self-interest in a way, and you still do it, right? You still show up in the most responsible way. So we were trying to find an education that could help with that. And we discovered a few things in the process. So in the overview of depth education, I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. So we make a distinction between depth education and mastery education. Mastery education is what you have in formal schooling, right? In universities, in K to 12, even in the kindergarten. And depth education mastery education focuses on the mastery of concepts, of skills, of competencies, and it's like in the first metaphor, like putting water in a cup, and this water could be the right answers, the right narrative, the right wording, but it's about the right, and it's generally a universal right? And another metaphor, it's about like conquering a peak, like going up a mountain, arriving at the top, and feeling the dopamine hit that you get when you've mastered something, achieved something. It's very much related to the sense of it's an empowerment, of a conquest. And needless to say, this kind of dopaminic action mode is what informs and has informed so far colonialism, right? But it's important to say too, the mastery education has its gifts. So, for example, in terms of building a plane, the kind of technical knowledge that engineers need for building a safe plane for us is probably mastery education. It's probably best conveyed through mastery education. So depth education is different. Depth education, rather than pouring milk in a cup or tea in a cup, it is more, or measuring it, it's more about peeling layers. It's first layering and then peeling the layers. And learning how to build our capacity to hold space for the multiple moving layers of complexity, but also to build the muscle to hold the weight of all the paradoxes, all the contradictions and the tensions between and within the layers. So in terms of the metaphor of the onion, it's about peeling the onion and crying a little bit in the process. And the crying is part of the process because we have been socialized to want specific things from education. And when that education doesn't deliver that affirmation, that expectation, we will find resistance emerging. And in depth education, we ask people to hold resistance as a teacher. About themselves, about where they're at, where they're going, the gap between where they think they're going and where they're actually at, these kinds of things. Another metaphor that we use is the metaphor of going into the water. It's deep diving into the freezing water in order to discover that you're mostly water, that you are also the water around you because you're part of you're nested in a bigger metabolism if we think about the complexity concepts, right? And then we're also the toxins that we put in the water. So depth education is about holding space for humanity, but it's not humanity in an idealized form as like humanity is all good. No, humanity, it's holding space for the good, the bad, the ugly, the broken, and the messed up of humanity within and around us. And that means that as we hold space for that thing, we can do that with also love and compassion in ways that are not about that we're not running away or throwing up or throwing a tantrum, about sitting with what's difficult, sitting with what is not pleasant. And in order to expand our capacity to do that, we have to be able to do that collectively together with the intent of expanding capacity to do it. So depth education is not something that we can force people to do. It cannot be coercive. It has to be an uncoercive rearrangement of desires, as Gayatri Spivak has also talked about in the Western literature on postcolonial theory, for example. And it has to activate an ethical imperative towards the other, towards the world, in our relationship with the world, that is not dependent on intellectual choices. So that's what we are trying to do. And there are three questions that depth education places at the center of any inquiry about education. The number one question is, how do we prepare ourselves to tackle the wicked problems of our time, including unprecedented complex dilemmas and also disasters of our own making that we will have to face together? How can we learn to do the kindest and most responsible thing to each other and to the land at all times, especially in times of crisis and polarization? How can we learn to choose sobriety, maturity, discernment, and responsibility in a culture of late modernity that often promotes and rewards the opposite? And in depth education, we work, and again, informed by what we were learning with indigenous people. We work with three layers of learning and unlearning. The first layer is the cognitive dimension. It's about meaning making, social organization, and theories of change. Second layer is the affective dimension, about capacity to sense and perceive things and to process neurochemical responses. And the next one is the relational dimension, the range of possibilities for weaving relations and for activating responsibilities. So from the indigenous communities, what they've told us explicitly is that in Western education, we think that we change the mind, the heart, and then the mind will change the heart and the whole body will follow, and our social structures are going to change. So if we change the narratives and the wordings that we use to describe things, everything else is going to change. And they said this is not possible. They said that change comes from the gut. So it's first the relational part that needs to be changed. Then that changes the way we process our both feelings, emotions, insecurities, fears, and traumas. And then the head follows. From that. It's the inverse process. And they emphasize also how colonialism has also colonized our affective domain. We are conditioned to desire, to fear, and to want certain things. And therefore, we are also conditioned to relate in certain ways. And they talk about the colonization of our relationality, of the ways we relate to the world, as the colonization of our unconscious as well. So there is, in their theory, the thing about the image that we put forward, which we could call as our ego, and everything else that that is around it, including the land trying to speak to us and to tell us what's the most responsible thing to do, maybe, and us only hearing our own narratives, right? So depth education tries to create a healthy suspicion of our ego so that we can decenter the ego, disarm the ego, declutter the saturated thoughts and feelings that are preventing us from sensing the messages of the land and what the land wants, and facing our responsibilities, and and also to disinvest. So depth education tries to help us to choose individually to disinvest from harmful desires, which is the part about the unconscious. So I would have to say, like, this is all inspired and informed by our experiences with indigenous communities in Brazil and also in other places. But it also has some resonance in some Western theories that are pushing back against more harmful Western theories. So we are kind of trying to make the bridges so that we can translate this into the field of education so that more people can start thinking about the ways that education has been colonized and that how it reproduces colonialism at an affective and relational levels. So when we think about depth education, the ultimate goal of it all is to help people to be able to, so it's to prepare people to be able to take 5 steps back when they face difficult issues and complex issues. And the first step back is the step back from yourself so that your decisions are not driven by your insecurities, by your fears, where you can decenter, disarm, declutter, and disinvest, as I said before, so that you can be present to the situation from a much wider space than your own projections, right? The second one is step back from your immediate context and times, looking at the bigger picture, knowing that even when you try to look at the bigger picture, there are limits to what you can see, but understanding that we're part of a longer continuum, a longer temporality, and the problems that we're facing in front of us are not, they have a history, and they are not just solvable with us wishing them to be different. They need, and it's not only about policy or information, it is a habit of being that we are also part of. So always self-implicating ourselves in the problems in order to create that kind of humility that is necessary for you to weave different relationships. Then there's step back from your generational cohort, understanding how different generations experience and think about the different things. And of course, there are different people within different generations, but it's useful to think about the patterns of how we've been, how we grew up, and what this socialization of our time has also or how it has also affected the ways that we experience the world, in order for us to find ways to talk and be accountable to each other, again from a different space. Number 4 is step back from the universalization of your social, cultural, economic parameters of normality. So this is about seeing your privilege as a loss. So thinking about how your privilege prevents you from seeing and experiencing, and this is very important for people in the global north, for example, who are afraid of social ecological collapse, who can't see that for us to have what we have in the global north, social ecological collapse have to be continuously happening to other communities. So any form of universalization is problematic. Because it imposes one, it looks at only one layer, and it's trying to impose a projection, an idealization of that layer. And this step back is necessary for us to see ourselves as, again, speaking in a multiplicity of other possibilities. And the same for discourse. This is just one possible way of addressing the issue in a sea of other ways, but most of the ways in the sea are mastery education. This is trying to do something based on what we've been instructed to do by the indigenous communities, that has a different direction, and we are trying to do that. And it may not be for everybody too. So 5 is step back from familiar patterns of relationship building and problem solving that you have been socialized into. So this is asking questions like, who are you accountable to? What possibilities for more responsible steps are already viable but are currently unimaginable to you and those around you? So here it's about opening up possibilities that are not imaginable but already viable, and expanding our range of accountabilities. So if we look at the 5 steps, each of them would probably take a lifetime for us to do. This is not an event. This is a process, right? For us to be able to do that in terms of confronting colonialism within ourselves. So we have to start somewhere, and the course is just the first step that we found as a way of doing that. So one of the things that we say in the course is that we're trying to develop some dispositions, right? And some of these dispositions are cognitive, some are affective, some are relational. And here we have, I think, 6 of them that we have tried to map so far. So the first one, the first cognitive disposition that we're trying to activate is diffractive assessment. Diffractive assessment is about layering the self and layering reality in order to articulate complexities and paradoxes. So your invitation to take a step back from yourself through the bus, for example, and sit with the internal complexities is part of this invitation. Because if you can't sit with your complexities, your contradictions, you're not going to be able to do that with what is around you, with the complexity around you. Then there's diachronic and analectic reasoning, which is about connecting dots in the bigger picture across time, but non-dialectically. Non-dialectically means that we're not trying to say this is wrong and this is the right thing to do. We are trying just to sit with that space between what's wrong, what's right, understanding that what's right is context dependent. And in terms of wicked problems, every solution in one layer creates a problem in another layer. So it's developing the capacity to sit with things that are difficult. Then we have relatedly psychoaffective stamina, which is about holding space for difficulties and discomfort without feeling overwhelmed, immobilized, or demanding quick fixes or rescue. Then there's ontosympathetic resonance, which is about tuning into the pain of others in oneself and interrupting harmful desires and perceived entitlements. So realizing the pain, even the pain that we are inflicting, and sometimes that we are inflicting without a choice, really, right? So in terms of the things that we buy and what we are asked to do within modernity in order to produce value and to be considered a worthy person, most of these things require violence towards other communities. And learning to sit with that, with both ability to respond, but also compassion and self-compassion and humility. So the next one is heteroglossic dexterity, which is helping people navigate the ambivalence of language and the cacophony of perspectives. So today we have people in different groups trying to fix the language that we're going to do that we're going to use to work with certain issues. And this is playing with the ambivalence of language, but also with the fact that language is flexible and malleable, right? And learning to navigate that and navigate the fact also that this is going to continue to happen across time. The language is going to change at a much faster speed. And the reason why it changes is important, but it's also important to see how this is being weaponized to actually separate us further. So we have to be careful there, and the course helps us to take that step back and say, like, am I using things as capital or as a currency, and what is the most responsible thing to do in any specific situation? I'm talking in general as well as at every step of the way. Then we have SMDR compass recalibration, which is moving towards the colonial forms of sobriety and serenity, maturity, discernment, and responsibility and accountability as we face shadows, learn to compost shit with joy, and get through storms together. So, in summary, depth education is not teacher-centered nor learner-centered, but it's world-centered. We have to be present to the difficult things in the world, including violence, unsustainability, denial of entanglement, and denial of the magnitude of the problem. It's not human trauma-informed, but it's planet trauma-informed. Again, if you're coming back to how indigenous people in Brazil relate to the metabolism of the planet, if the planet is in disease, we're all in disease. And we cannot protect ourselves from the planet because the planet is within us. And in order to learn how to respond and process trauma, we have to not try to protect ourselves from what's difficult. We will have to be able to expand our capacity to sit with what's difficult. So, in that sense, my work in research and education is very helpful because I've been looking at colonialism in education and the reproduction of colonialism in education for a long time. And now I found that there is a catch-22 in formal education. So there are common assumptions in formal education that create the conditions for us to be caught in the catch-22. So the first thing is that people in education, the field of education, feel that talking about negative things makes people feel demotivated, that complexity causes people to feel overwhelmed, that exposing complicities makes people feel uncomfortable, that lack of simple solutions immobilizes people, that uncertainty makes people feel anxious, and that talking about the possibility for wider social and ecological collapse can make people feel hopeless and angry. This we find both in the literature and in the practice of education. So the focus then is on making things short, simple, easy, light, fun, and hopeful. And this is a problem because then if education is trying to do that, it will create some forms of subjectivity, some identities that reflect these things and make it difficult for us to sit with the good, the bad, the ugly, the broken, and the messed up within and around us. So that subjectivity that kind of simple, easy, fun, and hopeful education creates well-educated modern subjectivities that are attracted to certainty, to control, to comfort, to coddling, and to convenience, that are very uncomfortable with complexity, ambiguity, paradoxes, and contradictions, that are afraid of certainty, humiliation, worthlessness, and irrelevance, and that have a desire for moral authority and accountable autonomy and the arbitration of justice and common sense. So this subjectivity is unprepared to recognize, let alone navigate, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambivalence, which we call VUCA. And they are also unequipped to build relationships across communities in historical dissonance that are based on deeper forms of trust, respect, consent, reciprocity, and accountability. So there is and this happens because this subjectivity requires an idealization of oneself and of the communities themselves to be able to have the motivation to do things. But that motivation is unsustainable with the level of layers of crisis that we are facing at this time. So that kind of of pattern then creates a merry-go-round where around people involved with change, with climate action, but also social action related to social and global justice, enter this merry-go-round. If you're not prepared to deal with VUCA, if you're not prepared to go deeper, you are going to be investing in safe, simplistic, feel-good, and look-good solutions that sustain the status quo or the image you have of yourself. The relationships with communities are going to tend to be tokenistic, transactional, driven by optics and consumption or virtue signaling, and it's going to be a narrow and limited imagination of what is possible and desirable. Generally, going back to the idea that colonialism has colonized both our ways of feeling, but also our ways of imagining beyond colonialism. So in order to invite people to decenter, disarm, declutter, and disinvest, we have tried to map the different patterns that colonialism operates and conditions our affective and relational modes of engaging with the world. And then we have in this acronym 5 sets of patterns where this happens. And the first one is E, the E of exceptionalism, the idea that we have to have somebody exceptional, right? We're not ordinary, that we are either exceptional or we're supporting the exceptional people to make the changes. Exaltedness is the need for that to be affirmed and validated all the time. The expansion of entitlements, when we say like we just want entitlements expanded, but we're not looking at our responsibilities in creating the problems. There's the externalization of culpability, when you say, for example, that governments and corporations are the only ones to blame, and I'm innocent here in this process, and I'm just part of the solution, not part of the problem. And then there's escape from responsibility. And this is most visible in political discourses. P is the P of progress, prosperity, purity, heroic protagonism, projective hope, which is most visible in orientations to development, social innovation, and sustainability, and entrepreneurship here too. I is the I of idealizations, innocence, immunity to critique, indifference, indulgence, most visible in cross-cultural engagements and also artistic practices. And the C is the C of certainty, control, compulsive consumption, competitiveness, comfort, convenience, complacency, most visible in approaches to learning and the design of education. And A It's about epistemic and moral authority, unrestricted and unaccountable autonomy, justice and common sense arbitration, guilt absolution, the avant-garde, and arrogance, which is most visible in intellectual engagement and activism. Now, if these are colonial patterns that are happening at our affective and relational layers of being, the interruption of this is a major task to invite people to be showing up from a space of humility, honesty, where they can sit with the good, the bad, the ugly, the broken, and the fucked up of humanity, and the humor and hyper self-reflexivity, where you are really thinking about all the different layers and what's the most responsible thing to do at any specific point. So, however, depth education requires readiness, which means willingness plus consent. In Facing Human Wrongs, we have a whole first unit that we ask people to do, and there's a questionnaire at the end that does this function of consent. But we understand that some people really have never tried depth education before, and they don't know necessarily what they're getting into. So we always leave the process open for people to step back and step away and say, like, this is not what I need right now, and I don't want to do it, and that's not what's right for me as well. So there's a part of readiness, and then what we can do with people is to develop these dispositions. We can't do more than that. So it's cognitive and affective dispositions with tools that we give people, and we give people a chance to be exposed to the multiple layers and contradictions and paradoxes, so that collectively they can expand their capacity to sit with that. And that's all we can do. Because the capacity piece of it, in the relational dimension, it only comes through practice. So we have people in the course, and we've had more than 400 people through the course, both in the Global North and the Global South, that have said that the outcomes of the course can only be felt later, much later, because this is not about mastering anything, but it's about a disposition and a practice that you will feel the results of the course only when you are faced with a crisis later. Then people report that they feel they are in a much wider space of response. Their ability to respond, or responsibility, has shifted significantly. And but the course is counterintuitive, and it's resistance comes up at different points, and when it comes up, we invite people to take a step back and to see the resistance as a teacher. Another interesting thing is that now the indigenous communities themselves are saying we want something like that, because we tend to think that because they are fighting at the front line of the fight, that they understand everything, that they have a wider understanding of all the struggles. And what the feedback we're receiving is that the cultural responsibility also needs to be within the indigenous communities, because there's a lot of conflicts, intergenerational, but also in terms of aspirations. Some people in indigenous communities will want, like, for example, the development of, let's say, the benefits that come with wind farms, and others are saying the wind farms are going to kill our birds. We don't want the wind farms here. So they will need tools as well to deal with the fact that indigenous communities are heterogeneous, and they are people who want different things. People are complex. Communities are complex. So we're now working with 3 projects that are trying to create a Facing Human Wrongs for the communities, the indigenous communities we're working with as well, according to their own priorities, right? So one of the things that we invite people to do, just in order to conclude this, is to give feedback to the course only after they have completed the cycles, the 6 weeks. So I hope that you are going to receive this invitation for this process in a good way, and that you will choose to go through the cycle and to give us feedback at the end. And this happens because the feedback we receive generally in the middle is when people want the course to be on their terms and do what they think is best for them at that specific point, which generally is about escaping from some of the difficult issues. So that's why we ask for the feedback at the end. But I hope that that you embark on this journey with us, and I'm willing to answer any questions if necessary. Thank you.